When you stop being available at every moment, something profound transforms in your life. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychoanalysts in history, discovered that our constant availability creates an invisible pattern that weakens our personal value. Have you noticed how people who are always available are frequently undervalued? There's a psychological reason for this. What happens in the collective unconscious when you establish boundaries? Why do some people command respect while others, equally talented, are ignored? The answer isn't in what you do, but in the psychic energy you project. In this video, we'll unveil the Jungian secret that can completely transform your relationships, career, and personal power. The truth is that when you stop being an open book, the world begins to read your pages with much more interest. In the depths of human psychology lies a counterintuitive truth that Carl Jung understood profoundly. What is scarce becomes valuable, while what is abundant often becomes overlooked. This psychological principle extends far beyond economics and into the very fabric of our personal relationships and self-worth. Jung observed that individuals who make themselves constantly available, whether emotionally, physically, or socially, often experience a diminishment in how others perceive their value. This isn't merely a social observation, but connects to fundamental psychological archetypes that shape our unconscious perceptions of worth. When we examine this phenomenon through a Jungian lens, we begin to understand that constant availability creates a psychological pattern that signals to others, and crucially to ourselves, that our time, attention, and presence hold limited value. Jung would describe this as an unconscious projection that others readily accept and reflect back to us, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Consider the archetypal image of the sage or the mentor in mythology, figures who are never readily accessible, but must be sought out with effort and intention. Their wisdom is valued precisely because it isn't freely distributed to all who pass by. Jung recognized that this archetype exists in our collective unconscious and influences how we assign value to others in our lives. The paradox emerges when we realize that our genuine desire to be helpful, supportive, and present, qualities that seem inherently positive, can undermine our standing in both professional and personal spheres. This isn't because these qualities lack merit, but because human psychology responds to contrast, boundaries, and the perception of value that comes from selectivity. In his writings on the individuation process, Jung emphasized the importance of recognizing and integrating our shadow aspects, those parts of ourselves that we typically repress or deny. For many, especially those socialized to prioritize others' needs, the ability to say no and to withdraw availability represents a significant shadow element. By integrating this capability, learning to value our own time and energy enough to sometimes withhold it, we begin a transformation that others can perceive often before we fully recognize it ourselves. This shift creates a fascinating psychological reaction in others. As Jung noted in his work on projection and transference, humans tend to project greater depth and significance onto that which they cannot fully access or understand. By creating appropriate distance, we allow space for others to develop a more complex and often more positive perception of us. The psychological mechanism at work relates to what Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear in different contexts. When we're constantly available, our persona becomes transparent and one-dimensional. By introducing unavailability, we add complexity and depth to our persona, making it more intriguing to others. It's important to understand that this isn't about manipulation or game playing. Rather, it's about psychological balance and authentic self-valuation. Jung stressed that true individuation requires honoring all aspects of the self, including our need for boundaries, solitude, and selective engagement. From a practical standpoint, this paradox manifests in numerous ways. The colleague who declines some meetings and is perceived as more important, the friend who isn't always immediately responsive, but whose advice is most valued, the romantic partner who maintains independent interests and continues to fascinate. In each case, the limitation of availability enhances rather than diminishes connection and respect. Jung would likely view this as part of the natural psychological economy, a system that assigns value based not just on inherent qualities but on perceived scarcity and the effort required to access those qualities. This isn't a superficial social dynamic, but one rooted in deep psychological structures that have evolved with human consciousness. By understanding this paradox, we can begin to make more conscious choices about our availability. This doesn't mean becoming distant or unresponsive, but rather being intentional about when, how, and to whom we make ourselves available. It means recognizing that our time and energy are finite resources deserving of respectful boundaries. The psychology of unavailability ultimately invites us to consider a profound question. How might our relationships and sense of self transform if we approached our own presence as something precious rather than unlimited? Jung's insights suggest that by honoring our own boundaries, we not only enhance how others perceive us, but also deepen our relationship with ourselves, perhaps the most valuable transformation of all. The unconscious mind operates through symbols, patterns and associations that often elude our conscious awareness. Carl Jung recognized that these hidden dynamics powerfully shape how we're perceived by others, particularly when it comes to our availability. This invisible game plays out beneath the surface of our interactions, silently determining our social value and influence. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious suggests that certain archetypal patterns are universally recognized across cultures and throughout time. One such pattern is the association between scarcity and value. At an unconscious level, we're wired to assign greater importance to what is rare, difficult to obtain, or requires effort to access. This psychological mechanism extends beyond material objects to people and their time, attention, and emotional presence. When you're constantly available, always answering calls immediately, dropping everything for others' needs, or maintaining an open-door policy without boundaries, you unwittingly activate an unconscious devaluation process in others. The collective unconscious interprets this pattern as a signal. This person's time and energy are abundant resources requiring no special effort to obtain. Consequently, the unconscious mind categorizes your presence as ordinary rather than exceptional. Jung would point out that this isn't a conscious, deliberate evaluation others make about you. Rather, it's an automatic psychological response operating below the threshold of awareness. People don't consciously think, this person is always available, therefore they're less valuable. Instead, they simply feel less compelled to prioritize interactions with you or to value your contributions as highly. The unconscious also works through projection, the process by which we attribute our own unconscious content to others. When you present yourself as perpetually available, you become a perfect screen for others to project their expectations of accommodation, compliance, and limitless giving. Over time, these projections solidify into a fixed image that becomes increasingly difficult to change. What's particularly fascinating about this psychological dynamic is how it creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The more consistently available you are, the more others unconsciously expect this availability, and the more they react with disappointment or even resentment when you eventually establish boundaries. Jung would describe this as the formation of a complex, an emotionally charged cluster of associations that develops around your perceived role as the always available person. The symbolic language of the unconscious interprets constant availability as a statement about your own self-valuation. When you don't protect your time and energy with boundaries, the collective unconscious reads this as, "This person doesn't value themselves highly, so why should others?" This interpretation isn't logical or fair, but it reflects the primitive, symbolic reasoning of the unconscious mind. Jung's work on psychological types offers another perspective on this phenomenon. He observed that individuals have different natural orientations toward the external world, extroversion, and their inner world, introversion. Those with a strongly extroverted attitude may find themselves particularly susceptible to overextending their availability as they're energized by external engagement. However, Jung emphasized the importance of balance. Even the most extroverted types need periods of unavailability to integrate experiences and maintain psychological health. The archetypal roles we unconsciously embody also influence how our availability affects our image. The eternal child archetype, for instance, seeks constant approval and therefore remains perpetually available. In contrast, the wise elder archetype knows the value of selective engagement and creates appropriate distance. When you shift from constant availability to thoughtful selectivity, you may be unconsciously activating more powerful, respected archetypal patterns in others' perceptions. Jung's concept of the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we repress or deny, plays a crucial role here as well. Many people, particularly those socialized to prioritize others' needs, have relegated their capacity for healthy selfishness to the shadow. Reclaiming this aspect allows for a more balanced approach to availability, one that honors both connection and separation. The unconscious also communicates through behavioral patterns rather than words. When you consistently drop everything to accommodate others, your actions speak a language the unconscious immediately understands. My needs are secondary, yours take precedence. This unspoken message shapes how others relate to you far more powerfully than any verbal assertions about respecting your time. Interestingly, the unconscious mind seeks equilibrium and completion. When you present as endlessly available, others unconsciously feel compelled to create balance by becoming less available to you. This explains the puzzling dynamic wherein the most accommodating people often receive the least accommodation from others, a pattern Jung would view as the psyche's attempt to restore balance. By understanding these unconscious mechanisms, you gain the ability to consciously reshape your image. This isn't about manipulation, but about aligning your external boundaries with your internal worth. When you become selectively available, you activate different unconscious associations in others, those of value, significance, and respect. The game of the unconscious ultimately reveals a profound truth. Your availability is a form of communication that speaks directly to others' unconscious minds. By becoming mindful of this communication, you gain the power to transform how you're perceived and valued, not through artificial tactics, but through authentic alignment with your true worth. The concept of the shadow stands as one of Carl Jung's most profound contributions to psychology. He defined it as the repository of those aspects of ourselves that we reject, deny, or refuse to see. Within this psychological framework, our patterns of excessive availability often conceal a complex shadow reality that, left unexamined, can lead to destructive consequences in our lives. Jung observed that what we repress doesn't simply disappear. It goes underground, gaining power in the darkness of our unconscious. The shadow of excessive availability contains uncomfortable truths that many of us work diligently to avoid confronting. Chief among these is the recognition that our constant availability may not stem from generosity or compassion, but from deeper psychological needs that remain unacknowledged. For many, the compulsion to remain perpetually available masks a profound, Fear of abandonment. By making ourselves indispensable, always ready to respond at a moment's notice, we unconsciously attempt to secure others' continued presence in our lives. Jung would interpret this as the shadow's strategy for protection. If we become essential through our constant availability, perhaps others won't leave us. This fear often originates in early attachment experiences, where love or attention felt conditional or inconsistent. Another shadow aspect of excessive availability involves the unconscious quest for validation and recognition. When we center our identity around being helpful, responsive, and accessible to everyone, we create a dependent relationship with external validation. Each time someone seeks us out, our sense of worth receives temporary reinforcement. This pattern reflects what Jung called an undeveloped relationship with the self, our essential core identity beyond social roles and others' perceptions. The people-pleasing behavior that accompanies constant availability represents yet another shadow manifestation. Jung recognized that beneath the smiling facade of the people-pleaser often lurks repressed resentment and unexpressed anger. This creates a psychological split where conscious behavior, saying yes, accommodating others, directly contradicts unconscious emotions, frustration, rage at being taken for granted. This division of the psyche depletes enormous energy and can eventually manifest as depression, anxiety, or psychosomatic symptoms. Perhaps most insidious among the shadow elements of excessive availability is the hidden power dynamic it often creates. While appearing self-sacrificing on the surface, the constantly available person frequently develops subtle methods of control and manipulation. By becoming indispensable, they ensure others remain dependent on them, creating what Jung would call an unhealthy symbiosis. This dynamic provides a sense of security, but prevents authentic relationship development and inhibits both parties' individuation process. The psychological consequences of these shadow patterns extend far beyond momentary frustration or fatigue. Jung observed that unintegrated shadow content inevitably erupts into consciousness, often in destructive ways. For those caught in patterns of excessive availability, this might manifest as sudden emotional breakdowns, explosive anger seemingly disproportionate to triggering events, or self-sabotaging behaviors that undermine personal goals and relationships. Physical symptoms frequently emerge as well. Jung, like his contemporary Freud, recognized that the body often expresses what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. Chronic fatigue, immune system suppression, tension headaches, and digestive issues commonly appear among those who cannot establish healthy boundaries around their availability. The body, in its wisdom, enforces limits that the conscious mind refuses to set. Another shadow consequence manifests in the quality of relationships. Jung noted that authenticity forms the foundation of meaningful connection. When excessive availability stems from fear or the need for validation rather than genuine desire to engage, relationships develop on a false foundation. Over time, this inauthenticity creates emotional distance despite physical or temporal proximity. We're always there, but never truly present in a way that allows for deep connection. The professional consequences of this shadow pattern can be equally devastating. Those who cannot establish appropriate boundaries around their availability often find themselves overlooked for advancement, assigned additional work without compensation, and generally undervalued in workplace settings. Jung would view this as the external world mirroring back one's internal self-valuation. When we don't honor our own limitations and worth, others unconsciously follow suit. Recognizing these destructive patterns requires what Jung called shadow work, the courageous willingness to examine the uncomfortable aspects of our psyche with honesty and compassion. This begins with questioning the underlying motivations behind our availability patterns. Are we responding from authentic generosity, or from fear, insecurity, or the need for approval? The answer often reveals itself in how we feel afterward. Genuine giving energizes, while compulsive availability depletes. Jung emphasized that integration, not elimination, represents the goal of shadow work. The healthy expression of availability emerges not from rejecting our helpful nature, but from bringing consciousness to it. When we understand our deeper motivations, we can make choices aligned with our authentic values rather than unconscious. Fears. The path forward involves what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, acknowledging both our desire to connect and support others and our legitimate need for boundaries and self-protection. By honoring both realities rather than swinging between extremes, we develop a more nuanced approach to availability, one that serves both ourselves and others more effectively. Ultimately, confronting the shadow of excessive availability opens the door to more authentic living. As Jung observed, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The discomfort of recognizing our unhealthy patterns creates the possibility for transformation. When we integrate our shadow aspects around availability, we discover the freedom to engage with others from a place of genuine choice rather than compulsion, the hallmark of true psychological maturity. In the vast landscape of Jung's psychological concepts, few are as transformative yet challenging to implement as the power of saying no. For Jung, the capacity to establish firm boundaries wasn't merely a social skill, but a crucial component of psychological individuation, the process through which we become our authentic selves. The simple word no carries immense psychological significance, functioning as both a declaration of selfhood and a gateway to more meaningful connections with others. Jung recognized that boundaries define not just what we keep out, but what we preserve within. When we examine this through a Jungian lens, we see that establishing limits around our availability serves as protection for our essential psychological resources, our energy, attention, creativity, and sense of self. In his writings on psychological types, Jung emphasized that each individual possesses a finite reservoir of psychic energy. When this energy is constantly depleted through excessive availability, the consequences extend far beyond mere fatigue into profound psychological imbalance. The archetypal dimension of saying no connects to what Jung might call the inner guardian, the psychological structure that protects the integrity of the self. This guardian function stands at the threshold between our inner world and external demands, discriminating between engagements that nourish us and those that deplete us. When we consistently override this guardian by saying yes when our deeper self requires no, we essentially betray an archetypal function essential to our psychological health. Many individuals struggle with boundary setting because they've internalized collective beliefs that frame self-protection as selfishness. Jung would view this as the unconscious influence of cultural complexes, emotionally charged collections of ideas that shape behavior below the threshold of awareness. These complexes often contain messages like, good people are always available, or putting others first is the only virtuous path. Recognizing these as cultural constructs rather than universal truths represents the first step toward psychological liberation. The psychological mechanics of saying no involve what Jung called differentiation, the process of distinguishing oneself from collective expectations and the demands of others. This differentiation creates psychological space in which authentic identity can develop. Without this capacity to separate, the individual remains psychologically fused with others' expectations, preventing the emergence of a true self. Each no, uttered from genuine self-knowledge, functions as an act of psychological differentiation, gradually building the infrastructure of a distinct identity. Jung's work on psychological complexes offers another perspective on boundary challenges. Those who struggle to establish limits often carry wounded inner child complexes, parts of the psyche frozen at earlier developmental stages where saying no felt dangerous. These complexes might have formed when boundaries were punished, when love seemed conditional upon compliance, or when security depended on accommodating others' needs. Healing involves recognizing these complexes at work and gradually learning that adult boundaries won't result in the abandonment or rejection the child self fears. The shadow aspects of boundary setting deserve attention as well. Jung noted that what we deny in ourselves often emerges in distorted, sometimes destructive forms. Those who cannot consciously set healthy boundaries frequently develop passive-aggressive patterns, unexplained resentments, or sudden explosive reactions that damage relationships. These represent the shadow's attempt to establish the limits the conscious self refuses to acknowledge. By consciously embracing the power of no, we integrate this shadow energy in a healthier, more constructive manner. Establishing psychological boundaries requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposing forces in creative tension, eventually producing a third position that transcends the original conflict. In boundary setting, this means holding both our genuine desire to connect and support others and our legitimate need for self-protection, allowing a more nuanced approach to emerge. This isn't about rigid rules, but about developing psychological flexibility guided by deeper wisdom. The relationship between boundaries and self-esteem forms another crucial dimension of this topic. Jung observed that healthy narcissism, the ability to value and care for oneself, provides the psychological foundation for genuine care toward others. Without this foundation, apparent generosity often masks unconscious resentment or manipulation. By establishing appropriate boundaries around our availability, we communicate to both ourselves and others that we possess inherent value beyond utility or function, a message that transforms all our relationships. Jung's insights into compensation, the psyche's tendency to create balance, illuminate why boundary setting feels particularly challenging at first. When we've established a pattern of excessive availability, both our own psyche and our social systems have organized around this pattern. Initial attempts to change create compensatory resistance, often manifesting as guilt, anxiety, or increased demands from others. Understanding this as a natural, temporary phase of psychological reorganization helps maintain resolve during this transition. The process of establishing healthy boundaries follows what Jung might call an alchemical sequence. It begins with nigredo, a dark phase of recognizing destructive patterns and their consequences. This leads to albedo, a purifying process where we clarify our authentic values and limits. Finally comes rubedo, the integration of these boundaries into a more whole, balanced way of engaging with the world. Each refusal that honors our authentic needs represents a step in this transformative sequence. Ultimately, Jung would view mature boundary setting not as separation, but as the foundation for more meaningful connection. When we engage from choice rather than compulsion, when we bring our authentic, energized presence rather than our depleted remnants, we offer something far more valuable to others. The power of no thus paradoxically enhances our capacity for genuine yes, creating relationships characterized by mutual respect, authentic presence, and sustainable engagement. This boundary-setting process constitutes what Jung called soul-making, the lifelong work of creating a container strong enough to hold the fullness of who we are. By establishing psychological limits that honor our nature, we gradually construct this container, allowing our unique gifts and contributions to develop within its protective embrace. The power of no, then, stands revealed not as mere refusal, but as the essential foundation upon which a meaningful, authentic life is built. In the silence that follows your no, listen carefully. It may contain the whispered yes of your authentic self, finally being heard. What parts of your life would transform if you stopped being everyone's emergency exit and became the guardian of your own sacred space?